First, Australia's government says it's willing to pay whatever it takes to help communities recover from deadly wildfires that continue to ravage the country. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the government was committing an extra $2 billion Australian dollars toward the recovery effort, in addition to the tens of millions of dollars that have already been promised. Experts say the fires are set to burn on until at least March. Nationwide, at least 25 people have been killed and 2,000 homes destroyed by the blazes. Well, the images are really telling the story. Let's get the analysis. Dr. Sharon George is joining us now, lecturer on environment and sustainability at Keele University up there in central England. Thank you very much for being with us. Scott Morrison has announced more cash, more money. Is that really what's required, throwing cash at the problem?
Well, I mean, cash will help. It will help to remediate some of that land. It'll help to mitigate some of the risk. But unfortunately, this is a situation that as we move to a future with more climate change, these types of events are more and more likely to happen. We're more likely to get more severe droughts, more fires, and, you know, I mean, the costs of mitigation would be better spent in prevention, really, rather than, you know, this reaction.
Does it come down to the old chestnut, the change in our global habits is what's required, perhaps more than the hard cash?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. I mean, Australia is no stranger to wildfires. Wildfires are part of their natural ecosystem anyway. But what we're seeing here is unprecedented. These are not normal wildfires. These are, you know, vast areas burning at high temperature, and we won't know for some time how bad the damage is. You know, normally a wildfire sweeps across an area very quickly, so, you know, the wildlife, some of the wildlife can burrow beneath the heat, and you know, we don't know yet how much of this area, how deeply these areas have been affected yet. So the other thing is that when an area recovers, some species will move in and overtake. If you've knocked out all of the wildlife, some species have no competition, and you end up with changing the balance that was there before. And so there's going to take an enormous effort, an enormous intervention to make sure that some of those areas and those habitats are restored to anything like that they were before.
Indeed, and as you're telling us that, Sharon, the images we're showing are really reinforcing what you're saying. The landscape completely razed, burned to a crisp, really. And it's hard to imagine that any animal has managed to survive that. And one can only imagine that some species perhaps might be lost.
Well, this is the risk that we have at the moment. I mean, we're looking at the loss of habitat. You know, anything that recovers from this, you know, we've lost. It's not just we see these pictures of koalas and kangaroos, but you think about the reptiles that are there, the insect populations, even, you know, we think about these big, large organisms, but what about the microbes and things that live in the soil fauna? When you change a system like this, that it's built on really fragile food webs. You know, that it's staggering to think how an area that vast is going to recover. This sort of pressure on the environment is something that is unprecedented, and we can do some things to prevent against this through like sort of burns and you know, sort of managing the land. But you know, on this scale, and when we're seeing temperatures this sustained, and with the winds and the conditions that are driven by climate change, it's hard to think that we can keep this back through artificial means, you know, for any as we go forward into the future.
40 degrees Celsius plus was the series of temperatures, record temperatures recorded in Australia. Some people, Sharon, deny that climate change exists. They say there are other factors that come into play with this. It could be poor forestry, it could be poor resource management, it could be the lack of resources for the local firefighters. They'll point to that rather than what you've just said, climate change as the cause.
Well, I think what you've got here is a perfect storm of all of those things. You know, the kind of analogy that I use is with smoking. You've got, you know, you can't point to one cigarette and say that one cigarette caused lung cancer. What you can say is the likelihood of of this happening is exacerbated by those rises in CO2 levels. And what we're seeing is more extreme temperatures. So the Indian Ocean dipole is one of the factors that's driven those high temperatures. And that, statistically, that's set to happen every 17 years. Now, because of climate change, we're seeing that happen just over every 6 years as we move forward. So the likelihood, the severity of these things that might happen anyway are going to just, there's no arguing that whatever the cause or whether something happens, climate change is not going to help.
I don't like criticising people, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's one of the problems that we have here, that because someone's garden isn't particularly on fire and they just see what's happening here via the TV news, they don't really understand the urgency of the situation. It's something they can basically separate themselves from and think, it doesn't affect me, when in reality, it does and it will.
Well, I think this is one of the things with climate change, isn't it? CO2 is something we can't see. We all emit it, regardless of how green we try and be. We all have an impact as humans on the planet. But one of the things is that climate change doesn't respect borders, and quite often some of the hardest hit areas are those furthest away from us, and those people that are hardest hit. Like, for instance, we're talking about fires now, but on the other side of that dipole we're seeing flooding, and people with the least voice in the world and the poorest people in the world are being affected the most. Yet they have the least control over the emissions that we're all producing globally.
And in terms of what people should do, I mean, clearly, you're doing some great work at the Sustainability Hub there in Keele. Can you give us a kind of like a 40-second up sum of what people should be doing, with the changes that we can all make to kind of help palliate the situation, to help calm the situation?
Well, I think generally our own personal habits, I think, eating more vegan food, and, because farming does have an impact. So doing less flying might be another personal choice we can make. But really, it's, there's some big changes that are going to happen if we're going to cut back on fossil fuels, and some brave decisions by governments. And I think really one of the things that we can do as humanity is support our governments that have to make these very, very difficult decisions that are not going to be popular among the voter. And I think if we can have a voice and tell the governments that we are behind them as they make these difficult choices, that's one thing that we can do.
Dr. Sharon George, Lecturer on Environment and Sustainability at Keele University in Central England. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And that's it for this section of the programme. Stay with us. Short break, then more news to come.